At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. At 27 years old, he was an Illinois state shooting champion with 0 confirmed combat kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves, and in the past 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. Other platoon leaders dubbed it his mail-order sweetheart. When he unpacked his Winchester Model 70, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount, at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer had joked about whether it was for deer or Germans. George said it was for the Japanese, but the rifle shipped out late, leaving him to watch fellow soldiers clean their Garands during the voyage to Guadalcanal, while his weapons sat in an Illinois warehouse. He requested it be sent via military mail, and 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a fragile marked wooden crate containing the rifle he'd saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. George's rifle weighed 9 pounds, with the scope adding another 12 ounces. The M1 Garand, issued to every other man in his battalion, weighed 9 pounds 12 ounces, with no magnification. George's Winchester was a bolt-action, 5-round rifle. The Garand, a semi-automatic, 8-round weapon. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon, but George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had fought since August, seizing and holding Henderson Field, but they had not taken Mount Austin or cleared Japanese forces from the coastal groves west of the Matanacao River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the GEU, garrisoning 500 men in 47 bunkers there. George's battalion attacked on December 17th, fighting for 16 days and losing 34 men killed and 279 wounded before finally seizing the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz was a different battlefield. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into massive trees, including trained snipers with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles, who knew the jungle and how to wait. The sniper threat escalated rapidly. January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. January 20th, another sniper killed 2 L Company men during a patrol. January 21st, 3 more soldiers died, one shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria, and he needed someone who could shoot, asking if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George laid out his credentials. 1939 Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards, the youngest winner in the state's history. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, and 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent the night cleaning his Winchester, which had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He checked the scope mounts and loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he'd brought from Tennessee, military ball ammo, the same cartridge the Garand fired. At dawn on January 22nd, he moved into the Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier, which overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence confirmed Japanese snipers operated from the area's massive banyan trees, some 90 feet tall with 8-foot-thick trunks, where a sniper could climb before dawn and hide unseen all day. George brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. Settling into the bunker, he began scanning the trees through his Lyman Alaskan scope, which had 2.5 times magnification, enough to spot movement in branches the naked eye would miss. Tuning out the constant jungle noise of birds, insects, and distant artillery, George glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 he saw it. A branch moved, no wind, just a small shift, 87 feet up in the 240-yard banyan tree. The branch moved again, and he spotted a dark-clad figure positioned in a fork where three branches met. The Japanese sniper faced east, watching the trail where George's battalion moved supplies. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right for wind, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the Winchester's glass-smooth 3.2-pound trigger, a weight he'd spent hours calibrating at Camp Perry before the war. The rifle kicked into his shoulder, the shot cracking through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell, tumbling 90 feet through the branches to hit the ground near the tree's base. George worked the bolt, ejected the empty cartridge, chambered another round, and kept his scope on the tree, knowing Japanese snipers worked in pairs. At 9:43, he found the second sniper, 60 yards north of the first in a different tree, 50 feet up, moving down the trunk in retreat, having heard the shot and knowing his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the tree, his rifle clattering through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded with a stripper clip, his hands steady, his breathing controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his face. He rolled left, pressed against the bunker wall, and identified the shot's origin, southwest, a new direction. Waiting 3 minutes, he inched back to his position and glassed the southwest trees, knowing the sniper would have relocated after firing, a basic sniper doctrine. At 11:38, he found him, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up, repositioned to a different branch in the same tree, a fatal mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion, and men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle now begged to watch him work. But George refused. Spectators drew attention, and attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill, stopping all movement during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing, returning to battalion headquarters at 1600 hours. Captain Morris was waiting, all mockery gone from his voice. He ordered George back to position at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain, turning the jungle floor to mud and limiting visibility to less than 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15, and by 8:45, visibility was sufficient to resume operations. At 9:12, he spotted the day's first sniper, who had climbed into position during the rain, using the noise to mask his movement. This sniper chose a tree 290 yards out, a longer range than the day before. The Japanese were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell, his 6th kill. The 6th kill brought an unanticipated response. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. The enemy had triangulated his position from muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short, the second 20 yards short. The third salvo would hit the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater as the third salvo hit, obliterating the bunker in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker, which provided cover and a clear view of the groves. The dynamic had shifted. The Japanese knew George was hunting them, and they were now hunting him back. This was no longer target shooting, it was a duel. 1423, George killed his seventh sniper. 1541, he killed his eighth, who had climbed 94 feet up a banyan tree for concealment, only to create a silhouette against the sky as the sun angle changed. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to retrieve George, who had been in position for 9 hours. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris ordered him to resume sniper operations at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and did the math. 11 Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves, 8 dead, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the survivors, the most experienced, and they now knew exactly what George looked like and what rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep, but gave up at 0300, sitting in his tent with the rifle across his lap. Rain started again at 4:15, heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the time to move to a new, unexpected position, 70 yards south of his previous post, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest in December. The spot offered excellent cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop, which it did at 7:43, slowing to a drizzle and improving visibility. At 8:17, George found sniper number 9, positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, only 40 feet up. An unusual choice, as most snipers climbed high for better sightlines. This sniper had prioritized concealment over elevation, using palm fronds to create a natural hide invisible from ground level. But George was elevated on the rocks, giving him a downward view into the fronds, where he saw the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. He aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger, then stopped. The position was too obvious, too easy. After 3 days and 8 kills, the remaining snipers would not make elementary mistakes. This was bait. George lowered his rifle and methodically scanned the surrounding trees for 11 minutes, checking every tree within 300 yards of the palm. At 8:28, he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, the sniper positioned in a perfect hide, concealed by branches and vines on 3 sides, with a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree, waiting for George to appear there or take the bait shot. George faced 2 problems. The real sniper was watching the wrong location, and firing at him would reveal George's actual position, giving the sniper time to relocate before George could work the bolt. If he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree and search for him. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and fell. George immediately swung his rifle toward the 91-foot banyan tree. The real sniper reacted to the shot, turning toward the sound, creating the movement George needed. He put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell, his rifle tumbling after him. 2 shots, 2 kills, but George had revealed his position. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition, sprinted east along the rock line, and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. 6 seconds later, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd just been, bullets kicking up dust and stone fragments for 17 seconds. When the fire stopped, George counted to 60, then relocated 100 yards east to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater, settling in with water up to his chest, resting the Winchester on the crater rim. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 comrades die over 3 days, knew George's tactics and rifle, and was somewhere in the trees, watching, waiting, planning. George scanned the jungle through his scope, where every dark spot could be a branch or a man. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, moving toward George's position. George spotted him 60 yards south, low to the ground, moving through undergrowth parallel to the tree line, using ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover, crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater, the Winchester shouldered, but the crater rim blocked his view. He would have to rise up to shoot, exposing himself. The Japanese sniper stopped at 9:52, 40 yards from the rocks, studying them for movement. George waited. Patience was the core of sniper work. The ability to let time pass and wait for the right moment instead of forcing a bad shot. At 9:58, the sniper resumed crawling, moving to 35, then 30, then 25 yards from the rocks, approaching from the south side, the same side George had evacuated under machine gun fire. The sniper had watched the machine gun attack, knew George had moved east, and was hunting him along his likely escape route. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks, moving into the machine gun nest and positioning himself facing east toward the drainage ditch, George's supposed relocation spot. He was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, facing the wrong direction, his back exposed. George had a clear, easy shot to center mass, even without a scope, but he hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations and outlived 10 comrades. He would not make a mistake. The exposed position in the rocks was another trap. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his scan. At 10:06, he found it. A second Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk, motionless, watching, waiting, his rifle aimed at the drainage ditch. Two men, not one. The 11th sniper had backup, or these were the final two snipers working together. George knew he could not shoot both before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots, giving them time to locate at him. He needed a new approach. Slowly, he lowered himself deeper into the water, submerging until only his eyes and the top of his head were above the surface, holding the Winchester skyward to keep water out of the barrel. At 10:13, the soldier in the rock stood up. He had watched the drainage ditch for 10 minutes and seen nothing, believing George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree, and both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, executing a sweep to flush George out. They moved past George's crater, between him and the tree line, their backs exposed. George rose from the water, slowly and silently, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder, water dripping from the barrel, his uniform, and his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, 42 yards away, the one who had been in the rocks, and fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree, who was turning and raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as he climbed out of the crater to retrieve his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that froze him. Japanese voices, multiple men, moving toward the fallen soldiers. The snipers had not been working alone. George dropped back into the cold, muddy crater, submerging until only his eyes were above the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The voices grew louder. At least 6 men, infantry, a patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. They stopped at the first body 42 yards from the crater, then the second, their tones urgent. At 10:28, the voices moved not back to the tree line, but toward the crater. They had found his boot prints in the mud, leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement, but not about tracks. He had 5 rounds in the Winchester, facing a minimum of 6 Japanese soldiers. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options: hide and hope they passed, or fight. The voices closed in. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while submerged, chambered another round, and rose up. Two more soldiers were at the rim. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted, more soldiers moving toward him. George climbed out of the crater's north side, 20 yards to a fallen tree, as Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle, bullets striking the ground and trees around him. They were firing at movement and sound, not confirmed targets. George stayed low, glassing the area and spotting two soldiers advancing toward the crater 50 yards out. He aimed at the lead soldier and fired. He dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group from the south, one from the east. He was about to be surrounded. He knew he could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact and retreat to American lines. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north through the jungle, vines catching his boots, branches whipping his face, Japanese fire chasing him. He ran for 90 seconds, diving into a dry shell crater, pressing against the wall and listening. The voices were distant now, the Japanese regrouping around their dead. He checked his rifle. Mud on the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. 2 rounds left, no stripper clips. His pack, with the clips, was near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving northeast toward American lines, walking low, using terrain for cover, the jungle silent except for his breathing and distant artillery. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter, challenged by a Marine sentry who led him to battalion headquarters to report to Captain Morris. George's debrief: 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days, 12 rounds fired, 11 hits, plus 3 infantry kills in the crater firefight using 5 rounds. Morris asked about his ammunition, 2 rounds left, and the rifle, functional but needing cleaning, with mud in the action and water in the barrel. He ordered George to clean the rifle and rest. No operations the next day. The battalion was moving east, the Point Cruz groves no longer a priority, and intelligence indicated the Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal, with withdrawal complete in 2 weeks. George returned to his tent and field-stripped the Winchester, spending 2 hours cleaning every component, running patches through the barrel until they came out clean, checking scope mounts, adjusting eye relief, and loading 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George feared a negative report, unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support, but instead found Morris and 2 other officers, including Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question: could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry revealed division had 14 Springfield rifles with Unertl scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines, and 40 regimental men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. He ordered George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, with one condition: he keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. Training began on January 27th, with 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper, qualifying with iron sights up to 500 yards, but none had combat sniper experience. None had killed a man from concealment. George started with the fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with Unertl scopes, heavier than the Garand in George's Winchester, stable but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught the men to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle offered no perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and build stable platforms from whatever materials they could find. Range training lasted 3 days. The men shot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, tasked with locating targets and providing security while the shooter engaged. Roles switched after each kill, keeping both men proficient and eliminating the single point of failure of a lone shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field, their mission to clear Japanese positions west of the Guadalcanal River. Small groups of infantry stragglers who had not evacuated, no snipers. George paired with Corporal Hayes, setting up on high ground overlooking a Japanese resupply trail. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired, and the soldier dropped. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more soldiers on the trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results: 23 Japanese soldiers killed, 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February, killing 74 Japanese soldiers by February 9th, a conservative count, only including confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated, with destroyers picking up troops at night from Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal's western tip. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, and George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese rearguards covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tenaru River when a Japanese rifleman shot him, the bullet striking his left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle, missing bone and major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where doctors cleaned and sutured the wound, ordering 3 weeks of rest with no combat operations. George spent 2 weeks at the hospital, during which the Japanese completed their Guadalcanal evacuation. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days, with 74 confirmed kills and 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations, earning official recognition from division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While recovering, orders came from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a classified mission in Burma. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific, his Winchester Model 70 packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold, the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. He did not know the Burma mission's details, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man with a rifle accurate to 600 yards would be invaluable. The transport reached India on April 3rd, and George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new 3,000-man unit, unofficially called Merrill's Marauders, officially designated the 5307th Composite Unit, on May 28, 1943, training since April in long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, and operations without supply lines, modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces operating deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Officially designated a rifle platoon leader, the U.S. Army had no formal sniper positions in its table of organization. But Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew what he could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India, with terrain different from Guadalcanal, but the same core challenges: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse: steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force. George modified his Winchester for Burma. The Guadalcanal missions had been short-range with regular resupply, but Burma would involve weeks-long patrols, hundreds of miles through jungle, where every ounce of weight mattered. He removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330, 2.5 times magnification, 8 ounces lighter, and swapped the wooden stock for a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. A small change, but critical when carrying 60 pounds of equipment on a multi-week patrol. Merrill's Marauders entered Burma in February 1944, their mission to advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield, critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with 4,000 troops, and the Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force carried all supplies on their backs, or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles, mortars, and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th, covering 83 miles through mountainous jungle in the first week. Men collapsed from exhaustion, malaria cases rose daily, and pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several were shot after breaking legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles and engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, harass, cut supply lines, and create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. 1 shot per engagement. The rifle's distinctive report would reveal his position. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him, so he learned to shoot and move immediately. 412 yards. A Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. 380 yards. A machine gun position. 290 yards. A sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months, the Marauders covering over 700 miles, losing more men to disease, malaria, dysentery, typhus, than combat. The 5,300-man unit that entered Burma was reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective troops by late May. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. A success, but the unit was combat ineffective, with too many casualties, too many sick, and too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign, and his Winchester did too, but the rifle that had been so effective on Guadalcanal was fired only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely engaged in the long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense vegetation where visibility was less than 30 feet. George realized modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard, and the era of the individual marksman with a privately owned rifle was fading. By June 1944, George was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders, who were disbanded. He was reassigned to training duties in the United States, promoted to captain, and stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he trained infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics, teaching the lessons he'd learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma. jungle movement, long-range target identification and engagement, independent operations without supply lines. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia, killing at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements. George stopped counting after Burma. It sat in a footlocker in his Fort Benning quarters. George rarely looked at it. The war had shifted, the Pacific Islands being retaken, American forces advancing through France and into Germany. The military was standardizing mass production, interchangeable parts, and identical training and equipment. George understood the necessity of industrial-scale modern warfare, but grieved the loss of individual skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering, the idea that a man with the right rifle and training could change a battle's outcome. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, and a Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill, studying politics and graduating with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, he spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions, eventually settling in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, later joining the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. For decades, George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but not about Point Cruz, the Japanese snipers, or the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down his experiences, not for publication, but for his own record, to document jungle warfare weapons and tactics while the details were still fresh. He wrote for 6 months, producing a 400-page manuscript of technical, detailed descriptions of rifles, ammunition, and ballistics. A friend at the National Rifle Association, NRA, read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant, believing it was too technical for general readers, but the NRA convinced him. The book, Shots Fired in Anger, was published in 1947, becoming a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. George described his Guadalcanal and Burma experiences with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what did not in combat. The book remains in print today, used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms, with George's descriptions of Japanese weapons standing as some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched military rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 to the M16, sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment, and the lessons of World War II relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. His Winchester Model 70, the rifle that outshot professionally trained Japanese military snipers, that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks, that changed how the U.S. military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history, most visitors walking past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it is not. It is a testament to skill, courage, and the power of the individual soldier. A reminder that in the chaos of war, a single man with a rifle, training, and patience can make all the difference. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit the like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this forgotten story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories from dusty archives every day, Stories about riflemen who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches across the world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered.